Hello, everyone. I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. At the edge of town, where the cracked pavement met the overgrown woods, stood an abandoned boarding school. Ashmore Academy had been closed for decades, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti and ivy. No one went near it, not even the teenagers who dared each other to sneak inside. The stories about Ashmore were enough to keep people away. They said that during its final year, 20 children vanished without a trace, and the headmaster hung himself in his office. The building had been condemned shortly after, left to rot, and with it, the terrible secrets of what had happened within its walls. Eleanor wasn't from the town. She didn't know the stories. She had inherited the land from a distant relative she'd never met. And as an architect looking to make a name for herself, she saw an opportunity. Ashmore Academy was a perfect candidate for renovation, historic, imposing, and isolated. She envisioned it transformed into luxury apartments or a boutique hotel. The locals warned her to stay away, but she brushed off their superstitions. She didn't believe in ghosts. On her first visit, the building loomed over her, its dark silhouette framed by an overcast sky. The front doors were chained shut, but a side entrance hung open, the rusted hinges barely clinging to the frame. As she stepped inside, the air changed. It was colder than it should have been, and the silence was so complete it pressed against her ears. Dust motes floated in the weak light that seeped through the broken windows, and the faint scent of mildew and decay hung in the air. Eleanor explored the halls, her footsteps echoing on the cracked tile floors. The building had a strange layout, with long corridors that seemed to stretch forever, and staircases that twisted in ways that didn't make sense. She found herself getting turned around more than once, but she told herself it was just the unfamiliar space playing tricks on her. As she ventured deeper, she began to notice strange things, scratches on the walls that looked like claw marks, children's toys scattered in odd places, and mirrors that seemed to distort her reflection. She felt a constant prickling at the back of her neck, as though she were being watched, but every time she turned around, the halls were empty. She found the headmaster's office on the 3rd floor. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a dark room beyond. Inside, the air was colder still, and a strange, almost metallic smell lingered. The room was empty except for an old desk, a toppled bookshelf, and a single black door in the corner. The door was unlike any she had seen in the building. It was made of dark wood that seemed almost charred, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. The carvings were symbols she didn't recognize, and the doorknob was a tarnished silver that felt icy to the touch. Eleanor tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed harder, but the door didn't so much as rattle in its frame. Something about it unnerved her, though she couldn't explain why. It felt wrong, as though it didn't belong there. She left the office and tried to focus on the rest of the building, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the black door, the way it seemed to hum faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though it were alive. That night, Eleanor stayed at a nearby inn. She couldn't sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of the black door, the carvings shifting and twisting as though they were trying to form words. She woke in a cold sweat, the sound of faint knocking echoing in her ears. The next day, she returned to Ashmore with a crowbar. She wasn't superstitious, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the black door was the key to understanding the building's dark history. She made her way back to the headmaster's office, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The door was as she had left it, standing silently in the corner. As she approached, she noticed something she hadn't before. Faint handprints on the surface of the wood, as though someone had been pounding on it from the other side. She hesitated, her heart racing, but she forced herself to press forward. The crowbar scraped against the wood as she wedged it into the frame. She pushed with all her strength, the door groaning in protest. Suddenly it gave way, swinging open with a deafening creak. The room beyond was impossibly dark, the light from her flashlight swallowed by the blackness. It was cold, colder than any place she had ever been. She stepped inside, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The walls were covered in the same strange carvings as the door, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. As her eyes adjusted, she realized the room wasn't empty. The floor was littered with bones, small and delicate, like those of children. Her stomach turned and she stumbled backward, her flashlight trembling in her hands. That's when she heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Stay," it said. "Stay with us." She turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, overlapping voices that spoke in a language she didn't understand. Shadows began to move along the walls, taking on shapes that were almost human, but horribly distorted. Long limbs, hollow eyes, mouths that stretched too wide. Eleanor screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't open. The shadows crept closer, their whispers filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts. She could feel them wrapping around her, pulling her down into the darkness. When she didn't return to the inn, the locals assumed she had come to her senses and left town. Weeks later, a group of teenagers dared each other to explore Ashmore Academy. They found Eleanor's flashlight in the headmaster's office, lying on the floor in front of the black door. The door was closed, and no amount of force could open it. One of the boys pressed his ear to the wood, curious. He pulled back quickly, his face pale. "I heard something," he said. "It sounded like crying." No one dared to stay long enough to investigate. The building was condemned again shortly after, but the stories didn't stop. People still claim to see lights in the windows at night and hear faint whispers when they pass by. And those brave or foolish enough to approach the black door say they can feel it vibrating under their hands, as though something inside is trying to get out. No one in Raven's Hollow spoke of the harvest after dark. It was a rule as old as the town itself. The village was small, nestled deep in the valley, surrounded by dense ancient woods that no one dared to enter. Every autumn, when the leaves turned blood red and the air grew sharp with the bite of winter, the town would prepare for the harvest, a grim ritual that none of the younger generations understood but obeyed all the same. There was no festival, no celebration. The harvest was not a time of joy, it was a time of survival. Maggie didn't believe in the stories. She had moved to Raven's Hollow 2 weeks before the first frost, a young teacher eager for a fresh start after a messy divorce. The town was quiet, the rent was cheap, and the locals seemed polite, if a little distant. But she quickly noticed their strange habits, how they locked their doors well before sunset, how they avoided the woods, and how their eyes darted nervously to the horizon as the days grew shorter. At the small school where she taught, Maggie overheard children whispering about the harvesters. They spoke of shadowy figures with hollow eyes and skeletal hands that came from the forest when the moon was full. They said the harvesters would take anyone caught outside after dark, dragging them back into the woods where no one ever returned. Maggie dismissed it as a local legend, a tale spun to keep kids from wandering too far. She even mentioned it to her neighbor, an elderly man named Frank, hoping to share a laugh. Frank didn't laugh. His face went pale and he leaned in close, his voice low and urgent. "You listen to me," he said. "You lock your doors before the sun sets. You close your curtains and you don't look outside. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think you see, you stay inside. Understand?" Maggie nodded, more amused than frightened. She wasn't about to let old superstitions dictate her life. But as the days passed and the air grew colder, she began to notice strange things. The woods that bordered the town seemed darker, the dead trees twisting unnaturally under the gray skies. At night she heard faint sounds, low whispers carried on the wind, the distant crunch of leaves as though something large was moving just beyond her sight. She told herself it was her imagination, but a seed of unease had taken root in her mind. The night of the full moon arrived quietly. The town was unusually still, the streets empty, the windows darkened. Maggie had stayed late at the school, grading papers, and by the time she realized how late it was, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. She hurried home, her breath visible in the frigid air. The sky was clear, the moon casting an eerie silver light over the landscape. As she reached her front door, she paused. The woods seemed closer somehow, the shadows between the trees shifting as though alive. A faint rustling sound reached her ears, and she turned, her heart pounding. There was nothing there. Shaking her head, she unlocked the door and stepped inside, locking it behind her. She tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it lingered, a prickling at the back of her neck. That night, as Maggie sat by the fire with a book, the whispers began. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened, she realized it was something else. The whispers were soft, almost melodic, but the words were incomprehensible. They grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to fill the room. She stood, her pulse racing, and moved to the window. Against her better judgment, she pulled the curtain back just an inch. The street was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But at the edge of the woods, she saw them. Dozens of figures, tall and impossibly thin, standing perfectly still. Their faces were pale and featureless, their bodies draped in tattered, blackened cloth. They didn't move, but she felt their gaze, cold and piercing, as though they could see straight into her soul. Maggie dropped the curtain, her hands trembling. She backed away from the window, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and she clapped her hands over her ears. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. A single tap on the door, then another and another. She stood frozen, staring at the door, her mind racing. The knocks grew louder, more forceful, rattling the frame. The whispers turned to low, guttural growls, and she could hear the faint scrape of nails against the wood. "Don't let them in," she whispered to herself, Frank's warning echoing in her mind. "Don't let them in." The knocking stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. She held her breath, straining to listen. A sudden crash shattered the stillness, and she realized it had come from the back of the house. Her blood turned to ice as she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to any person. Maggie ran upstairs, slamming the door to her bedroom and locking it. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The whispers returned, louder than ever, seeping through the walls like smoke. The door rattled as something pounded against it, the wood splintering under the force. She pressed herself into the corner, her eyes wide with terror as the door began to give way. It stopped. The whispers faded, and the house fell silent once more. Maggie sat there, trembling, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When she finally worked up the courage to open the door, the house was empty, but the walls were covered in deep scratches, and the floor was littered with blackened leaves. She fled the town that morning, leaving everything behind. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She never returned to Raven's Hollow, but the memories stayed with her. The whispers, the figures in the woods, the sense of something ancient and hungry watching her from the shadows. Years later, she read an article about the town. It had been abandoned, the residents vanishing without a trace. The only clue left behind was a single message carved into the door of the old schoolhouse. The harvest is complete. And on quiet nights when the wind is just right, Maggie swears she can still hear the whispers, calling her back to the woods. There is a place in the northern wilderness, far from any town or highway, where the trees grow impossibly tall and the air carries an unnatural stillness. In the heart of this forest lies Blackwater Lake, a body of water so dark and still that it mirrors the sky perfectly. Local legends say the lake has no bottom, and that beneath its surface lies an ancient village, one swallowed by the water centuries ago. Nobody knows how the village came to be submerged, but the stories say it is cursed to pull anyone who dares linger too long on its shores into its cold embrace. Emma had heard the stories as a child. Her grandfather used to tell them around the campfire when their family would visit the nearby cabin every summer. He spoke of strange lights that flickered over the lake at night, of voices calling from the water, and of those who ventured too close, never to return. Emma had always dismissed his tales as just that, tales. But when her grandfather passed away, leaving her the cabin, she decided to visit for one last trip. She wanted to sell the property, but first she needed to see it one last time to settle her memories. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, the forest closing in around her as she approached the lake. The cabin itself was just as she remembered, small, cozy, and perched at the edge of the water. The lake stretched out in front of her, dark and still, just as her grandfather had described. The sight of it filled her with an uneasy nostalgia, a mix of childhood wonder and a sense of something foreboding. Her first night at the cabin was uneventful. The air was cool and the forest was eerily quiet, but she chalked it up to being alone in such an isolated place. She sat by the fire, flipping through an old photo album her grandfather had left behind. Many of the pictures were of the lake, always taken from the safety of the shore. One photo caught her attention. It was old and faded, showing a group of men in a small rowboat on the water. Their faces were blurred, and in the background, just beneath the surface of the lake, there was a shape. A tall, shadowy figure that made her stomach churn. That night, she had trouble sleeping. She woke several times, certain she'd heard something, a soft tapping on the window, the faint sound of water lapping against the shore, and once, a low, almost imperceptible hum. Each time, she forced herself to stay in bed, pulling the blankets tighter around her. In the morning, she walked down to the lake, her boots crunching on the damp earth. The water was impossibly clear, yet dark, as though it absorbed all the light that touched it. Standing at the edge, she felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic sensation that made her want to wade in. Shaking her head, she backed away, her grandfather's voice echoing in her mind. "The lake wants to take you. Don't let it." That afternoon, she decided to explore the forest around the cabin. As she walked, she began to notice strange things. Trees marked with deep gashes like claw marks, patches of earth where no grass grew, and stones carved with strange symbols she couldn't recognize. The forest felt wrong, as though it were watching her, the shadows between the trees shifting when she wasn't looking. When she returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. The lake looked different in the fading light, the surface rippling slightly despite the absence of wind. She stood at the window, watching, when she saw it. A light, faint and flickering, hovering over the water. At first, she thought it was a reflection of the moon, but as it grew brighter, she realized it was moving. It floated closer to the shore before sinking beneath the surface. That night, the dreams began. She dreamt she was underwater, her lungs burning as she sank deeper and deeper. Around her, the remains of buildings loomed, houses, a church, and a clock tower, all encrusted with algae and barnacles. In the windows of the submerged houses, faces stared out at her. Their eyes were wide, empty, and glowing faintly in the dark. She woke gasping, the sound of water filling her ears, only to find herself still in bed. The room silent and still. The next day, she found the rowboat her grandfather had kept tied up on the shore. It was old and weathered, but still sturdy. She wasn't sure why she decided to take it out. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the strange pull of the lake that she could no longer resist. She rowed slowly, the water so still it felt like she was gliding across glass. The farther she went from shore, the quieter the world became, the sounds of the forest fading into nothing. At the center of the lake, she stopped. The water beneath her was so dark it seemed endless, and for a moment she felt utterly alone. Then she saw them, shapes moving beneath the surface, slow and deliberate. At first she thought they were fish, but they were too large, too human. One of them rose closer to the surface, and she caught a glimpse, a face pale and bloated, its mouth hanging open as though it were screaming. Panicking, she turned the boat back toward shore, rowing as fast as she could. But the lake resisted her, the water growing heavier, the boat barely moving. She could feel something beneath her, brushing against the bottom of the boat, and she screamed as a hand, white, skeletal, and impossibly long, reached up and gripped the edge. Another hand followed, and then another, until the boat was surrounded by them, dragging it down. The last thing she saw before the boat overturned was the clock tower from her dream, rising out of the water, its bell tolling a deep, mournful sound that echoed through the valley. When a search party arrived at the cabin a week later, they found no sign of Emma. The boat was missing, and the lake was as calm and still as ever. But in the cabin, they found her grandfather's photo album open on the table. The picture of the men in the rowboat had changed. Now Emma was among them, her face pale and blurred, her eyes wide with terror. The villagers say that if you stand on the shore of Blackwater Lake at night, you can see the lights flickering on the water, and if you listen closely, you'll hear the tolling of the clock tower and the faint, desperate screams of those who have been claimed by the village beneath the lake. It started with a phone call late at night. Mark had been working late at his office, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the air always smelled faintly of stale coffee. He was the last one in the building, wrapping up the final touches on a report, when his cell phone buzzed on the desk. It was an unknown number, but that wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the static-filled voice on the other end. "Come to the 13th floor," it said, barely audible beneath the crackling. "Hurry." Mark frowned. His building didn't have a 13th floor. Like many older buildings, it skipped from 12 to 14 due to superstition. He hung up, assuming it was a prank, and went back to work. But the call came again, and this time the voice sounded strained, almost desperate. "They're coming. You have to hurry." A chill ran down his spine, but he tried to brush it off. It was late, he was tired, and his imagination was getting the better of him. But then he heard the elevator ding at the end of the hall. His office was on the 12th floor, and as far as he knew, no one else was in the building. He stood, peering out of his office toward the elevator. The doors slid open, revealing an empty car. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he approached the elevator. He told himself he was being ridiculous, but something about the stillness of the empty building felt wrong, oppressive. He stepped into the elevator, his finger hovering over the button for the ground floor. But before he could press it, the doors closed on their own, and the elevator began to ascend. Mark stared at the buttons. None of them were lit. The elevator hummed quietly, its movement almost imperceptible, but he could feel it rising. His stomach tightened as the display above the door flashed 13. The elevator came to a stop with a soft chime. The doors slid open to reveal a hallway he had never seen before. It was dimly lit, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper that might have once been white, but had long since turned a sickly yellow. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic. He hesitated, every instinct telling him to stay inside the elevator, but the doors refused to close. The car sat there, waiting, its bright interior almost mocking in contrast to the gloom beyond. He stepped out. The carpet beneath his feet was damp, squelching with each step. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, vanishing into darkness. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights, some of which flickered erratically. The elevator doors closed behind him with a soft ding, and when he turned, the elevator was gone. In its place was a blank wall, the wallpaper seamless. Panic gripped him, but he forced himself to move. He walked down the corridor, his shoes leaving wet prints on the carpet. The farther he went, the more the hallway seemed to change. The wallpaper grew darker, stained with shapes that looked disturbingly like handprints. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath misting in front of him. The doors along the hallway were identical, plain, wooden, with tarnished brass knobs, but none of them had numbers. He tried one at random, but it was locked. He tried another and another, but they were all the same. The oppressive silence pressed against his ears, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the faint squelch of his footsteps. And then he heard it, a faint sound from behind him. It was a soft shuffling like bare feet dragging across the wet carpet. He froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. Slowly he turned, but the hallway behind him was empty. The lights flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw a shadow at the edge of his vision, long and thin, slipping into the darkness. He started walking faster, his heart hammering. The shuffling sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by a faint whispering. The words were indistinct, like dozens of voices speaking at once, rising and falling in a grotesque harmony. He broke into a run, the whispers now echoing all around him, and the shadows along the walls seemed to ripple and stretch, as if something was moving just beyond the edges of the light. He didn't know how long he ran, but the hallway never ended. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, and the doors began to look different. Some were cracked open, revealing glimpses of rooms that shouldn't exist. Endless staircases spiraling into darkness, mirrors that reflected not his image but something standing behind him, and walls covered in what looked like writing, though the letters were in no language he recognized. The whispers grew louder, the words clearer now. They were calling his name. He stopped at one of the open doors, unable to resist the pull of the voices. Inside was a room filled with old filing cabinets, their drawers open and spilling papers onto the floor. At the center of the room was a desk, and on it sat a phone, its receiver off the hook. The static-filled voice he had heard earlier crackled through the line. "You shouldn't have come," it said, the words distorted but unmistakable. "They'll take you now." The shuffling sound was right behind him. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. The figure standing in the doorway was impossibly tall, its body stretched thin and unnatural. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale skin, but its head tilted toward him as though it could see. Long, bony fingers reached out, and the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. Mark stumbled backward, tripping over the scattered papers. The figure moved toward him, its limbs bending at impossible angles, its movements jerky and unnatural. He scrambled to his feet, running out of the room and back into the endless hallway. The lights flickered wildly now, casting shadows that danced and twisted along the walls. The whispers followed him, growing louder and louder until they were screaming his name. Ahead he saw another elevator, its doors standing open. He sprinted toward it, throwing himself inside just as the figure reached for him. The doors slid closed and the screaming whispers stopped abruptly. The elevator descended, the hum of its motor the only sound. When the doors opened again, he was back on the 12th floor. Everything was as it should be, the clean, brightly lit hallway, the familiar hum of the office. But something felt wrong. He walked to his desk, his legs shaking, and found his phone sitting there, the screen cracked. A voicemail notification flashed on the screen. He played the message, his hands trembling. The static-filled voice spoke again, quieter this time. "You escaped," it said, "but you'll never leave." Mark quit his job the next day, but the hallway never left him. At night, in the stillness of his apartment, he could hear the faint hum of the elevator, the flicker of distant lights, and the soft shuffle of bare feet approaching his door. No one in the old town of Gravenhurst dared to enter the Ashwick Hotel. It had been abandoned for decades, left to decay under the weight of its own terrible history. The locals avoided it, whispering dark tales of its cursed past. Some said the hotel was a place where time had stopped. Others claimed it was a doorway to something much worse. But the story that everyone agreed on was about the silent room, a single locked suite on the top floor where no sound could escape, and no one who entered was ever seen again. Jason had never believed in ghost stories. A freelance photographer, he specialized in documenting abandoned places, capturing the eerie beauty of forgotten buildings. When he stumbled upon the Ashwick Hotel while researching potential projects, he knew it was perfect. The photos would sell for a fortune. The idea of a silent room was just local folklore, something to draw in tourists or scare the kids. He booked a week in Gravenhurst and packed his gear. When Jason arrived, the hotel loomed over him like a dying giant. The once grand facade was blackened with mold, its windows shattered, and ivy crawled across its face like veins. The wrought iron gates hung crookedly, squealing in the wind as he pushed them open. As he approached the entrance, he noticed the air seemed heavier here, damp and oppressive, and the world grew unnervingly quiet. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as though the hotel had swallowed all sound. Inside, the lobby was a ruin. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and rot. The reception desk still stood, its once polished wood warped and crumbling. Faded newspapers were scattered across the floor, their headlines barely legible. Jason snapped a few photos, the flash of his camera casting sharp shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should have. He spent the first day exploring the lower levels. The dining room was filled with broken chairs and tables, the grand chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. The kitchen was a maze of rusted appliances and shattered tiles. He found the old ballroom, its once polished dance floor warped and buckling, the mirrors along the walls cracked and fogged. Every room felt wrong, as though the space itself was watching him. That night, he set up camp in one of the less damaged rooms on the second floor. He was used to the discomfort of abandoned places, the creaking floors, the groaning walls. But the silence here was different. It was too complete, too unnatural. Even his own breathing sounded muffled. As he lay in his sleeping bag, staring at the cracked ceiling, he thought he heard something faint, like a whisper carried on the air. He convinced himself it was just the wind. The next morning, Jason decided to find the silent room. The locals had said it was on the top floor, but no one seemed to know the exact number. As he climbed the grand staircase, the air grew colder with each step, and the silence deepened as though the hotel itself was holding its breath. The top floor was darker than the rest of the building. The windows were boarded up, and the only light came from his flashlight, which cast long, trembling shadows. The hallway stretched out before him, the doors on either side numbered in faded brass. He moved cautiously, running his hand along the wall for balance. The numbers weren't sequential. Room 303 was next to room 415, and further down, room 607. It didn't make sense. Finally, at the very end of the hall, he found it. The door was unmarked, its surface smooth and featureless, but he knew this was the silent room. The air around it was icy, and as he approached, he felt a strange vibration, almost like a low hum, though he couldn't hear anything. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't turn back now. The door wasn't locked. It opened slowly with a groan, revealing a dark, empty space. Jason stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was entirely bare, the walls smooth and seamless with no windows or furniture. The air felt thick, almost liquid, and his ears popped as though he were deep underwater. As he moved farther into the room, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his heart racing, but the door was gone. The wall where it had been was now smooth, unbroken. His flashlight flickered and the beam dimmed, as though the darkness were swallowing the light. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass. It came from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest. He raised his flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and Jason realized it wasn't coming from a corner. It was coming from all around him. The air grew colder still, and his breath misted in front of him. The tapping turned into a low, guttural whisper, words he couldn't understand, overlapping and rising in volume. Shadows began to shift along the walls, forming shapes, figures with long, twisted limbs and hollow eyes. They emerged slowly, stepping out of the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural. Jason backed away, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figures surrounded him, their mouths opening and closing soundlessly. The whispers grew deafening, pressing against his skull like a physical weight. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows closed in, their cold hands reaching for him, pulling him down into the dark. When Jason didn't return to the village, a search party was sent to the Ashwick Hotel. They found his car outside, but the building was empty. His camera was discovered in the lobby, its memory card corrupted. On the top floor, they found a single unmarked door, but it wouldn't open, no matter how hard they tried. The room beyond remained silent. Years later, new owners attempted to renovate the hotel. Workers reported hearing whispers, footsteps, and distant tapping. One by one, they quit, refusing to enter the building again. The renovations were abandoned and the Ashwick Hotel was left to decay. And sometimes, on quiet nights, if you stand at the edge of the property, you can hear the faint click of a camera shutter and the sound of footsteps that never seem to leave. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any road or map, lies a place called Barrow Mine. Once a bustling coal operation in the early 1900s, it was shut down after a catastrophic cave-in that claimed the lives of over 100 miners. The official story was that the mine was unsafe, prone to collapse, but the locals whispered a different tale. They spoke of strange occurrences before the disaster, voices in the tunnels where there should have been none, shadows moving in the lamplight, and workers disappearing without a trace. After the collapse, the mine was sealed, the entrances buried under tons of rubble. But even now, more than a century later, those who wander too close swear they can hear faint knocking from deep underground, as if the earth itself remembers what happened there. Maggie and her brother Tom weren't locals. They were urban explorers, thrill seekers who ventured into abandoned places to capture their eerie beauty. They had documented forgotten hospitals, crumbling factories, and ancient asylums. But when Maggie heard about Barrow Mine, she couldn't resist. The stories, the tragedy, the isolation. It was exactly the kind of place their audience loved. The mine was remote, hard to find, but Maggie had done her research. With maps, a rented 404, and their gear, they set out on a crisp October morning, the mountains shrouded in mist. The trail to the mine was overgrown, nearly impassable. Fallen trees and rocks blocked their way, forcing them to abandon the vehicle and hike the last few miles on foot. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the quieter it became. Birds and insects faded into an oppressive silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The air grew colder, carrying a faint, metallic tang. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. When they finally reached the mine's entrance, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The entrance was partially collapsed, but a narrow gap remained, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. Maggie felt a shiver run down her spine as she stared into the darkness. but she brushed it off. It was just adrenaline, she told herself. Tom, always the braver of the two, grinned and adjusted his headlamp. "Ready for this?" he asked. The air inside the mine was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of earth and decay. Their footsteps echoed in the narrow tunnels, the sound amplified by the jagged walls. Rusted tools and broken tracks littered the ground, remnants of the mine's long-abandoned operations. Maggie snapped photos while Tom filmed, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the silence. They followed the main tunnel for what felt like hours, the air growing colder the deeper they went. Strange markings appeared on the walls, symbols carved into the stone, crude and unfamiliar. Maggie paused to examine one, her fingers tracing the rough edges. It looked like a spiral, but its lines twisted and broke in ways that made her head ache if she stared too long. "Probably graffiti," Tom said, though his voice lacked conviction. The tunnel eventually opened into a massive chamber. Their headlamps revealed old mining carts, piles of debris, and what looked like an elevator shaft, its rusted cage dangling precariously above the void. The air here was colder still, and their breaths fogged in the light. As Maggie set up her camera to capture the chamber, she heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. She froze, holding her breath. The sound came again, louder this time, echoing through the cavern. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Tom nodded, his face pale. "Probably an animal," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. The tapping continued, growing closer, more deliberate, like the sound of a pickaxe striking stone. Maggie's pulse quickened as she scanned the darkness. "Let's keep moving," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. They followed the sound down another tunnel, their lights barely cutting through the gloom. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and now it was joined by another sound. Low whispers, indistinct but unmistakable. Maggie couldn't tell if they were ahead of her, behind her, or inside her own head. The tunnel ended abruptly at another shaft, this one sealed with rusted metal bars. Beyond the bars, the darkness seemed alive, shifting and writhing, as if something waited just out of sight. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, forming words that made no sense but filled Maggie with a primal terror. Tom stepped closer to the bars, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely audible over the whispers. The response was immediate. A loud, guttural sound erupted from the darkness, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The whispers turned into screams, a chorus of voices rising in agony and rage. Something moved beyond the bars, something massive, its form indistinct, but undeniably wrong. Long, twisted limbs reached through the gaps, clawing at the air. "Run!" Maggie screamed, grabbing Tom's arm. They sprinted back the way they had come, the tunnel echoing with the sound of their panicked footsteps and the relentless scraping of claws on stone. The whispers followed them, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air grew colder, the walls closing in, and Maggie realized with a sickening dread that the tunnel wasn't the same. It twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading them deeper instead of out. Tom tripped, his flashlight skittering across the floor. Maggie turned to help him, but froze. The shadows at the edge of her light moved, taking on human shapes. Figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies gaunt and skeletal, their faces twisted in expressions of pain. Their hollow eyes locked onto hers, and they reached out with bony hands, their whispers turning into a single, desperate plea. "Help us!" Maggie pulled Tom to his feet, dragging him forward. The tunnel finally opened into the chamber they had entered earlier, but something was different. The elevator shaft was gone, replaced by a gaping hole that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. From its depths came the tapping, louder now, and the sound of heavy shuffling footsteps. A shadow emerged from the hole, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its head tilted as it looked at them, empty sockets glowing faintly in the dark. It moved slowly, deliberately, its clawed hands scraping against the stone. Maggie and Tom backed away, their lights flickering as the creature advanced. The last thing Maggie saw before her flashlight died was the creature reaching out, its fingers brushing against her arm. The touch was ice cold, and the whispers filled her head, drowning out her thoughts. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Days later, a search party found their abandoned vehicle and a trail leading to the mine. Inside, they discovered Maggie's camera, its memory card intact. The footage showed the siblings exploring the tunnels, their voices growing more frantic as the whispers began. The final clip was of Maggie, her face pale and terrified, turning to the camera and whispering, "Don't come here." The mine was sealed again, but the locals say it doesn't matter. On quiet nights, when the wind is still, you can hear the tapping echoing through the mountains, a reminder that some places are better left buried. In the dense, untamed wilderness of Maine, there is a house that no one dares approach. It has no official name, no address on any map. Locals call it Blackthorn House, though few can say where they first heard the name. It sits at the end of an overgrown path, hidden deep within a forest where the trees seem older than time itself. The stories say the house was built long before the town of Alder's Hollow existed, by a man who wanted to escape the world. He succeeded. Too well, perhaps. The stories vary. Some claim the house is cursed, others say it's alive. There are whispers about people who went inside and were never seen again. Every few years, a group of thrill-seekers or curious outsiders would venture into the woods, and inevitably, they'd vanish. Their bodies were never found. The locals don't talk about it anymore. Most pretend it doesn't exist. Anna had no such reservations. She was a writer, one whose career had begun to flounder. After years of mediocre reviews and dwindling readership, she was desperate for inspiration. When she heard the stories of Blackthorn House, she saw an opportunity, a chance to write something truly terrifying, a tale steeped in local folklore. She packed her car and headed north, brushing off the warnings of the innkeeper where she stayed. "You don't want to go out there," the woman said, her voice trembling. "That house, it doesn't let people leave." Anna smiled politely and left early the next morning. The drive to the forest was uneventful, the landscape shifting from quaint rural towns to vast stretches of wilderness. The path to the house wasn't marked, but Anna had done her research. The directions she'd pieced together from old records and whispered rumors led her to a narrow dirt road, barely visible through the dense undergrowth. She parked her car at the edge of the forest and continued on foot, the morning sun barely penetrating the thick canopy above. The deeper she ventured, the quieter the forest became. The chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves gave way to an oppressive silence, broken only by the crunch of her boots on the dirt path. The air grew colder, carrying a faint, metallic tang that made her stomach churn. After what felt like hours, the trees parted, revealing Blackthorn House. It was larger than she'd expected, a sprawling Victorian mansion with towers and gables that jutted into the sky like jagged teeth. The wood was dark and weathered, covered in patches of moss and ivy. The windows were blackened, reflecting nothing, and the front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Anna hesitated, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of the house's presence, as though it were watching her. She forced herself to move forward, her camera in hand. Inside, the air was heavy and damp, the faint smell of rot clinging to her nostrils. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the weak beams of light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The house was eerily intact. Furniture sat undisturbed, as though the occupants had left suddenly, never to return. A grand staircase dominated the entrance hall, its banister carved with intricate designs that seemed to writhe in the dim light. Anna began to explore, snapping photos as she went. Each room seemed stranger than the last. The dining room was filled with rotting food, plates and glasses arranged neatly as if awaiting guests. The parlor was lined with shelves of books, their pages blank and brittle. In one of the bedrooms, she found a mirror that reflected not her image, but the room behind her. Empty at first, but then the faint outline of a figure appeared, growing closer until she turned away in terror. The deeper she ventured, the more the house seemed to change. The hallways grew longer, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Doors led to rooms that shouldn't exist. Endless corridors, staircases that spiraled into darkness, and spaces so vast they seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the house itself. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, some still oozing a dark, tar-like substance. As night fell, Anna realized she couldn't find her way back to the entrance. The house seemed to shift around her, its layout changing with every turn. Her flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air grew colder, and she began to hear faint sounds, whispers that echoed through the halls, distant footsteps that always seemed to be just out of sight. Her phone had no signal, and the battery was draining faster than it should. Panic set in as she wandered aimlessly, the whispers growing louder, forming words she couldn't understand. At times, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye, figures slipping into doorways or disappearing around corners. Once, she turned and saw a tall, shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall, its head tilted unnaturally, its arms too long. It didn't move, but she ran anyway, her pulse hammering in her ears. The house grew darker, the light from her flashlight barely illuminating the space ahead. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and rising into a deafening roar. She stumbled into a room she didn't recognize, its walls covered in mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The reflections didn't move with her. They stood still, their eyes following her, their mouths slowly curling into sinister smiles. She backed out of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The hallway beyond was lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. As she passed, she could see glimpses of what lay beyond. Endless darkness, rooms filled with bones, and places that looked like other parts of the house but felt wrong, as if they were copies made by something that didn't understand the original. Her flashlight died as she reached the base of a staircase. In the darkness, she heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps descending from above. She pressed herself against the wall, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone's flashlight. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural sound, like breathing mixed with a growl. The light from her phone flickered on, and she aimed it toward the staircase. The figure that emerged was not human. It was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tightly over its bones, its face a mass of shifting shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and it began to move toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural. The whispers rose to a crescendo, drowning out her screams as she turned and fled. Anna doesn't remember how she escaped. When she came to, she was lying in the middle of the forest, her camera and phone missing. The house was nowhere to be seen, as though it had never existed. She stumbled back to her car, her clothes torn and her hands covered in scratches. The locals found her the next morning, wandering aimlessly along the dirt road, her eyes wide with terror. She never spoke of what she saw, but she never returned to writing. Years later, a group of hikers found an old camera buried in the woods near where Blackthorn House once stood. The photos were blurred and distorted. But in one they saw a figure standing in a dark hallway, its face hidden in shadow, its hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. Hidden deep within the woods, miles from any known road, lies the remnants of Blackwood Asylum. Abandoned for decades, it is a place shrouded in mystery and fear. The asylum was once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, a place where society sent those they wished to forget. But Blackwood had a darker reputation. The doctors were known for their cruel experiments, their treatments more akin to torture than care. When a fire consumed part of the building in 1952, killing dozens of patients and staff, the asylum was shut down, and the survivors vanished into obscurity. Over the years, stories of ghostly apparitions and strange occurrences turned the asylum into a forbidden legend. Few dared to approach, and those who did returned with whispers of something unnatural lurking within its walls. Jenna was a documentary filmmaker, always chasing the next big story. When she heard about Blackwood Asylum, she knew it was exactly the kind of project she needed to revive her struggling career. The tales of the forgotten asylum and the horrific events that transpired there were irresistible. She recruited her small team, Alex, her cameraman, Sarah, her researcher, and Nate, the sound technician. Armed with cameras, recording equipment, and a map cobbled together from rumors and old documents, they set out on a cold autumn morning to find the infamous asylum. The journey was grueling. The dense forest seemed alive, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder the deeper they ventured, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy above. By the time they found the asylum, the sun was low on the horizon, casting the building in eerie shadows. It was a massive structure, its stone facade cracked and weathered. Vines crawled up the walls, and broken windows stared out like empty eyes. A sense of unease settled over the group as they approached, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown path. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were stained with water damage, and graffiti covered every surface. Rusted gurneys and overturned wheelchairs littered the hallways, their wheels squeaking faintly in the breeze that filtered through the broken windows. The deeper they went, the more the outside world seemed to disappear. The sounds of the forest faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against their ears. Jenna led the way, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. Alex filmed everything, his camera light flickering intermittently. Sarah clutched her notebook, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. Nate trailed behind, his headphones on as he monitored the audio. "I'm picking up interference," he muttered. "Static. It's like someone's talking, but I can't make it out." They reached the central wing, where the most notorious experiments were said to have taken place. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the dim light. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. Sarah recognized them from her research, marks associated with occult rituals, though their exact meaning was unclear. She explained them hesitantly, her voice trembling. "Some of the doctors, they were rumored to have been involved in things beyond medicine, things they shouldn't have been." As they explored, the atmosphere grew heavier. The building seemed to pulse, the air vibrating faintly as though it were alive. Doors that had been locked swung open on their own, and shadows moved at the edges of their vision. Jenna tried to keep the group focused, but the unease was palpable. They reached a long hallway, its walls lined with patient rooms. The doors were numbered, though many of the plaques had faded. At the end of the hall stood a single door, its surface untouched by time. The number 13 was etched into the wood, and a faint hum emanated from behind it. "Let's check it out," Jenna said, her voice steady despite the knot of fear in her stomach. Alex hesitated but followed, his camera rolling. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in darkness. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with jars containing preserved organs, bones, and other unidentifiable objects. In the center of the room was a chair, bolted to the floor, its leather straps worn and frayed. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed by an unseen force. The temperature plummeted, and a faint sound filled the air, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Nate ripped off his headphones, his face pale. "It's not static," he said. "It's voices, too many to count." Jenna stepped closer to the chair, her flashlight catching something on the floor. A series of concentric circles had been carved into the wood, their grooves filled with a dark, dried substance. Blood. She crouched down to examine it, but the moment her fingers brushed the edge, the whispering grew louder, the voices overlapping into a cacophony. The door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. Alex's camera light flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The whispers turned to screams, and the chains above them rattled violently. Something moved in the corner of the room, a figure barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its face hidden beneath a veil of shadows. It moved toward them with a jerky, unnatural gait, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Run!" Jenna shouted, pulling Sarah to her feet. The door wouldn't budge, and Alex fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking. The figure grew closer, its mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Just as it reached them, the door flew open, and they stumbled into the hallway. They ran blindly, the screams following them, echoing through the corridors. The building seemed to shift around them, the hallways twisting and changing, leading them deeper into the asylum instead of out. Doors slammed shut as they passed, and the air grew thicker, making it harder to breathe. Jenna's flashlight died, plunging them into near-total darkness. They reached a staircase that spiraled downward into the basement. They had no choice but to descend, their footsteps echoing on the metal steps. The basement was worse than the floors above. The walls were covered in rust and what looked like dried blood, and the air reeked of rot. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct. They called out their names, mocking and taunting, as though the building itself was alive. In the deepest part of the basement, they found a massive steel door, its surface covered in chains and locks. Something pounded on the other side, the force of it shaking the ground. Jenna turned to the others, her face pale. "We can't open it," she said, but it was too late. Nate, driven by some unseen compulsion, was already undoing the locks. The moment the last chain fell away, the door burst open, and a wave of darkness spilled out. It wasn't empty, it was alive, filled with countless writhing forms, their hollow eyes and gaping mouths emitting an unearthly wail. The darkness swallowed Nate first, pulling him into the void as he screamed. The others ran, but the asylum was no longer a building. It was a labyrinth, a trap designed to keep them there forever. Jenna doesn't remember how she escaped. When she woke, she was lying in the forest, her clothes torn and her body covered in scratches. Alex and Sarah were gone, their fates unknown. The footage from Alex's camera was corrupted, but one frame remained intact, a single image of the steel door, wide open, with something monstrous staring out. The asylum remains hidden, but Jenna knows it's still there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close. And on quiet nights, when she closes her eyes, she hears the whispers calling her name, reminding her that no one truly escapes Blackwood.